I'll let Kim talk a little bit about her background and I'll turn it over to you to kick off our training.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Very nice to see you here. Yes, so I've worked with Jennifer for, I guess, 6 years now. And before that, I was an in-house public relations person pitching media around the world. But prior to that, I actually worked in social media. So it's been really interesting to kind of see this convergence of social media with media relations as we're seeing digital media really continue to grow, and also individuals being able to jump into that media space even without a true journalism background or PR background. So I have been working in PR, between social media, corporate communications, media relations for about 15 years now. And it has changed a lot. When I first started in social media, I I was basically tasked, in the role that I was in at the time, with figuring out what Twitter was and how we could use it in business. And obviously, since then, we have seen it take off not only as a bit of a micro news platform, but as a place where you can engage with other individuals and also kind of find your little corner of the internet. And then, of course, we had Instagram and Facebook and TikTok. So there are all these platforms where you can not only share your own brand story, but connect with others, and they can support actually getting your message out there as well. So Jennifer gave a little background, but Spotlight PR is a PR agency, and we focus on social good and social good stories. And as Jennifer mentioned, my main role is pitching media. So today, and I touched on this a little bit, our priorities would be to understand better what this new earned media landscape is in the digital world, how it not only has affected traditional media, but what that means for bringing in this idea of alternative media, and then understanding the role that alternative media plays in that entire media landscape. We'll talk about how to identify your relevant targets in that space, especially as we see that everything feels saturated in a digital world. Figuring out what the angle is once you identify your targets, how to make your story sound more relevant, more interesting, among the vast number of pitches and stories that are now out there, and then how to craft that pitch. What makes it very similar to a traditional media pitch, how it might be a little different, since, as I mentioned, we are seeing so many people jump into the media landscape as individuals. And I'll touch on what that means, why that's a little different than maybe pitching a traditional journalist. So, what is alternative media? I think it has a reputation more recently as being more conservative media. And I want us to come away understanding that is not necessarily the case. I believe that came from a large number of people in the population finding themselves skeptical of media and the news they were receiving. However, alternative media really just means anyone in the digital space that is not a traditional news outlet, not necessarily a newspaper or a magazine or anything that we're used to pitching, we're used to getting before the internet came out as to your traditional news, but that is progressive media as well. So it could mean social media. There are a large number of influencers in every subject matter area, really, where they could be someone that you pitch to help get your story out because of their audience being a niche, because of their large number of followers. It also means podcasts. These have grown exponentially, and there are podcasts associated now with traditional media outlets. There are tons with outlets like NPR or the New York Times, but anybody can make a podcast. So there are also a large number within small subject matter areas that an expert or an advocate in that space decided to start because they wanted to share their message and what they're passionate about. That can be a really powerful place to find your niche and what the right person for you to talk about your story with. YouTube channels can also certainly be podcasts. I think they kind of overlap in that a lot of people who start a YouTube channel go on to have a more uh, robust podcast and vice versa. But then they can also be separate. So thinking of podcasts living on platforms like Spotify or Apple, don't forget to search YouTube, which might seem more like social media, but it's a really powerful alternative news platform now. Newsletters, we get tons of emails. Our inboxes are totally oversaturated. However, I know I at least still subscribe to a couple newsletters that I find relevant for the topics that I'm really interested in. So again, finding that little niche that really relates to your subject matter and the ones that are reaching the people who want to read about that can be even more powerful than getting a news story in a larger outlet with a larger audience, because that newsletter is really going to reach the people that actually want to read it. And then, of course, blogs, those have been around a long time, but there is that opportunity to not only pitch for someone to write about what you're pitching, but offering a guest post and the opportunity to partner. And so going back to traditional media, what has changed? It's not just that we're seeing an influx of podcasts, but the actual media landscape has changed. All traditional news outlets are online. I don't know about you all, but I don't really ever read a physical newspaper anymore. Most of the news I get, even from traditional news outlets, is online. They all also have their social media platforms. We're reading headlines a lot more than we're reading the whole story a lot of the times. So, of course, having a good hook, having a good angle is important. Mainstream media outlets, like I mentioned, are producing new media. They are producing alternative media. They have their own podcasts. They even have journalists that are solely focused on a podcast and are not writing traditional news stories. So thinking of that, even when you're looking to get into a traditional news outlet, is important for reaching the right person, the right journalist to tell your story. And then I mentioned individuals being out there in digital media. This has really, I think, leveled the playing field for all of us because anyone's voice can be amplified. We know that's not always a good thing, but if we kind of change the narrative and look at it more as an opportunity to amplify our own voices and the stories that we want to share, it really can be. And what I mentioned about individuals having podcasts, I think what can be great is the difference between a traditional news story and what we're seeing in digital media is subject matter experts, fellow advocates, your allies also have these platforms with a large audience where you can reach the audience that you want, but you also have an opportunity to make a relationship and a partnership with someone who is not just interested in telling your story one time when you have a good news hook, but is actually really interested in the subject matter as well. And then we touched on this a little bit. The general public is skeptical of traditional mainstream media. That can be good and bad. The traditional media has a tendency to get hooked on one storyline for a long period of time and just taking different angles with that one storyline. So people are getting a little tired of that, and they're looking for real news, and they're looking for the stories about the subjects they care about, and that's why we're seeing such an increase in viewership of YouTube and listeners of podcasts. And so that's an opportunity for us. And just to get a little bit more detailed on the numbers, there is data to support everything I'm saying. And so the reason this digital media matters is, like I mentioned, people are listening and they're looking for the stories in other places than traditional media. Unfortunately, newsroom employment is falling. It continues to fall, 57% between 2008 and 2020. 71,000 jobs went to about 31,000. So those journalists are entering digital media spaces. They're also entering PR. They're going into jobs that relate to the subjects that they care about. And so that's also an opportunity, is targeting those people that are most interested in the stories that we have to tell and finding the places that they may now be. We have a lot of freelancers. That's a really great place to find someone to pitch your story. So I think alternative media can also mean it's not just necessarily pitching an editor directly, but maybe finding the right freelancers, and then they can find the right outlet for you as well, whether that's a podcast or a traditional media outlet. And then the number of digital native newsroom employees has risen. So, like I mentioned, those newspapers are starting their own digital platforms, but we also have an influx of digital media, and that is everything from a podcast to a blog to an online newsletter. So 7,400 workers to about 18,000 in 2020, and that is continuing to grow according to Pew. Unfortunately, again, the number of journalism jobs will continue to drop. By 2031, Georgetown University projected that we're going to lose another third. And then not only are we seeing the number of jobs drop, those newsroom employees are primarily living in the big cities. So as traditional newsroom employment drops, we're seeing people leave the cities and go to other places, and then kind of start their digital media channels that matter to them and matter to the places that they live. The traditional newsroom employees are still in New York, LA, and DC, and so they are really not representing a large portion of the population. And that's something important to remember when we are pitching stories that might be located in other parts of the country or might matter more to people in other parts of the country. 75% of consumers report that podcast hosts are actually their biggest influencer in their purchasing decisions. So that might not relate as much if we're talking about policy and advocacy, but that doesn't mean that if it's driving their purchasing decisions, it's not also driving the things that they care about. So if 75% of consumers are looking to a podcast host as to what they're going to buy, they're probably also looking at influencers and podcast hosts and the people that they like to listen to for hearing about the things they care about, the stories that matter, influencing their views, their thoughts, and the direction of what they want to listen to and hear about. And this is just that I like figures in terms of really letting that sink in. So this is just a really good little graphic that shows that drop of the traditional newsrooms against the increase in the digital native newsrooms. So while there is still a separation, there still might be less digital native, or as of 2020, that gap is really shrinking. And so where does that stand for us as PR people and communications people? Well, we outnumber journalists 4-1. So that means there are a lot more of us emailing journalists than there are of journalists that want to hear from us. So that's also a reason why we want to target those alternative, untraditional news outlets that might be more interested in hearing from us. We know email inboxes are flooded, ours are too. We have to figure out how to stand out. And to me, I think we have to remember that journalists are people. And if we know that journalists are people, then again, going back to the fact that if we're talking about alternative media, there are a lot of individuals that were not journalists getting into that, subject matter experts, advocates. And so standing out to them as a person is really to me and what I have found in my pitches, the best way to get someone to write you back or to actually read your email. And that's just finding something that you relate on. It could be outside of the pitch that you're sending. It could also be why the pitch that you're sending is relevant to them specifically. It could be something else that they've done that you compliment them on. I recently just personally had a pretty well-named journalist write me back because I realized she was writing a book that had to do with where I live in South Carolina. It had nothing to do with my pitch, but she was so flattered and so excited that someone was excited to read her book that she wrote back, and we had a good conversation after that. But it also has to be genuine. I was not just tooting her horn. I actually am excited about this book. I think it's going to be really interesting. So be genuine in those pitches too. And then we know that single themes, like I mentioned, have dominated programming and storylines. So again, if you have a story that it could be the best story of the year, but if it's not fitting in with the narrative that those outlets are telling, it's going to be really hard to force your way in there. And that's where finding those digital outlets, that alternative media that focuses on what you want to talk about is going to be key. And we've seen that happen basically since COVID, where COVID just dominated. And now we're seeing other subjects, 2024 election, Biden, Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, we can't get away from it. So finding those places where your story actually is relevant is really key right now, because even good pitches, unfortunately, don't really stand out anymore. So I like to call this the new PR opportunity. And if you're on social media, you've probably seen a meme that says, "Welcome to the corner of the internet." And we see that from influencers, and it might be kind of something silly of, where we're not focused on diet culture or something like that. But this actually is true for, in my opinion, every subject area. So there is a corner of the internet for you. That is almost the beauty of the saturation and the fact that anybody can have a platform now, is there is a space where your story matters, your voice will be heard, and finding those people and getting in that community, that online community, is key. And so what that means is the audience might be smaller, but they're people that care. So they're actively listening. They are wanting to hear what you have to say. And if we're talking about issue advocacy, they will want to amplify your voice and the message that you're delivering. Those target audiences are actually easier to reach, I think, even though it seems impossible with such an influx of the number of accounts out there, the number of social media accounts, of podcasts. And then, of course, PR being 4-to-1 in journalism. Once you find your niche, once you find your corner of the internet, it becomes even easier to tell your story because they are active listeners who want to hear your news and who want to share the good news that you have. And like I mentioned before, that means those people that you find in your community they are also educated on the information that you're sharing. They understand it. So you probably don't have to start at such a high level. You can get a little deeper into what you want to discuss. You can get into the details a little bit more. They will become your allies, they'll become your advocates, and you can actually tell a better, more informed, and more impactful story. So finding your niche. So how do you identify the subject area that your message falls into? I kind of think of it as one of those thought bubbles, and it's, well, what are all of the different ways that I could talk about this? So if I'm talking about a healthcare platform or or some sort of app, well, what does it fall into? It might fall into health. Maybe it falls into women. Maybe it falls into social good. It could even fall into tech. So there are all these different areas that your subject might hit, but they can also go a little bit deeper than traditional media. So if we think about a reporter beat, there are specific beats that we see. So you have tech reporters and health reporters, but you might be able to get even more niche when you get into the alternative media space. And so once you start just doing your searches, you'll find those smaller audiences that are really truly related to your subject matter. Google is my best friend. I still think that Google is the best way to start research. Using words like best, top, you'll find lists in there, and Google does its own work on the analytics of finding who has the biggest audience, the biggest names that pull up, and doing that same search on YouTube, on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify. You can go right into your Spotify search and type in your subject, and a bunch of podcasts are going to pop up. They'll even show you where they come from. So you might start by seeing New York Times, feel like maybe that's a little too big. Maybe I should go smaller. Just keep looking, they're in there. And so choosing your target is really thinking about your spokesperson as well. So getting a little bit deeper into it than just what is the overall subject that I want to talk about. Well, who's talking about it and what are they passionate about? So if you spend some time with your spokesperson, and you might find, well, okay, we're launching a health platform, or we're talking about women's health, but actually what she's really passionate about talking about is, how can this app, or how can my services help women who are caring for others, self-care for carers? Get a little bit deeper on what your spokesperson wants to talk about, and then you'll find even more of those platforms that are specific to the story that they can tell and the information that they can offer. Um, so the blogs and the podcast categories that their passions fall into may overlap with what the subject matter you start with is, but you might find that you can even go a little further and find some more in there. So once you start searching the targets, write down the subjects that you would search, and then find the right targets through there. So this was going to be an activity that I was going to have you do on your own. If you would like to, we can certainly do that. But I know we're recording this, so I don't know if we want to take the time to stop now. But this is how I would ask you to start your search. Really thinking about, what can your spokesperson speak to, what do they fall into, and just start jotting it down and go from there. So identifying the angle, once you start searching alternative media, we have seen these two dominate headlines. It seems very pop culture. It seems like it doesn't fit in. But what is it that could fall into what is in this bigger media story, especially as they're dominating social media? So American Airlines very smartly created a flight to Vegas from Kansas City, and they used Travis Kelce's number for one flight and 89 Taylor Swift for the other flight. I mean, to me, the brilliance, the creativity. So there is a way to use storylines that are out there to your benefit, and just seeing how they might relate to what it is you want to talk about. It takes some brainstorming, it takes some creativity, but there is a way to find your niche within those storylines that are dominating the media. So start with, the trending topics. Super Bowl 2024 election. I talked a little bit about that. Oscar nominations are out there. Black History Month coming up. And as we talk about advocacy within these, think about what the people that are being focused on and talked about, what is it that they care about? What are the themes that are out there that you could fit within those narratives and within those topics that are already being talked about? So, with the Oscar nominations, we saw a lot of media around the fact that Ryan Gosling was nominated for this movie that was supposed to be about feminism, and yet the female director and the female lead were not. So there, there's an angle there for those of us in issue advocacy to use for the stories that we want to tell. And then identifying that unique perspective or the personal story that your spokesperson could add. So I touched a little bit on this. Pitching a story and pitching, especially in alternative media, a podcast, a YouTube channel, a blog, is really going to rely on your spokesperson, because for a podcast, you have to give them a person to interview. For a blog, you have to give them a person to guest write and a unique story. So, what really makes that spokesperson special within the topic that you're pitching, and how can they add something to it? So, I mentioned the idea of self-care for carers. This is something that someone we've worked with is really passionate about, even if it is separate from the wide range of topics that she could speak to intelligently, intellectually. So identifying, what it is that your spokesperson, or what it is that you, when you're pitching, can add to that story that might be a little different. And again, identifying the angle, what trending topic can you relate to? This is, again, an activity. So what first popped into your head as I was talking about that? And, I was going to take, as I mentioned, like 5 minutes here, but as you're listening, I want you to just keep writing stuff down, because anything that pops into your head can matter. It doesn't have to be the best pitch. It doesn't have to be the best angle. Just start jotting down the ideas that you're having of, oh, I thought of this that has to do with our story angle or our pitch as we're talking about Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift. And not that you have to use them as your example or as your angle, but as we're discussing, what are these big storylines? 2024 election, Super Bowl, Oscars, what is coming in into your brainwaves as we're discussing that you might be able to find a creative angle for your next pitch. And then I mentioned people moving out of the big cities a little bit as these traditional newsrooms are scaling down. And of course, we also saw that in COVID, just with offices closing. So, another really good way to target alternative media is thinking local. There are a lot of blogs, a lot of even smaller YouTube channels that are related to your geographic region and related to a smaller audience, that can actually be much more highly relevant, because they are people that are not only going to be interested in the topic that you're discussing, but in everything else that you share in your daily lives. And they can continue to be your ally, someone you can build a relationship with, a future partnership with, because they're right there locally. So you might be able to find topics even outside of what you're pitching, or the story angle that you have, that you can relate to, that, like I mentioned earlier with the pitch that landed me a conversation, can lead to further conversations because you have that in common. And then there are also, as I mentioned, not just that they might be in your physical area, but there are those outlets in the alternative media, in addition to traditional, that are local, that are going to be more interested in those local stories, more interested in your local spokesperson, and in any of the advocacy that you're doing that is much more relevant to a local audience than nationally. It might seem like a story that should matter nationally, but you're going to get more attention within your local media. And it's an opportunity to start a relationship. You can invite them to a coffee or to have a Zoom meeting, and actually meeting in person is going to facilitate a much better long-term relationship, where that's someone that you can go to further down the line, with more stories, with more angles, but also just as someone to use as a resource for yourself as well. And you might find yourselves connecting in other ways. So, as you're actually crafting your pitch, this is something I mentioned earlier about the value of tailoring your message. So not only looking at maybe what they've written about that relates to what you're pitching, but what have they written about that they're proud of? What are they tweeting about? What are they posting on Instagram about? Really look at who they are as people and tailor your pitch to them. Find something within that content that you can actually speak directly to. So, what relates to you as well? Keeping it authentic. What is it that you see within the messages that they're sharing or the content they're sharing that resonates with you as the person writing the email? And tailor it to that before you get into the pitch of what you're actually trying to kind of sell them on. And then in that pitch, make sure you offer what is good for them. What is the impact that your spokesperson is going to have on their audience? How are they offering something that their audience is going to want to hear, can get something new out of? And why you think they're the best person to have that conversation with, especially when we're talking about podcast interviews that will be recorded, where the conversation will be heard, not just quotes written down. Why is it them as an individual that you want your spokesperson to have a conversation with? Why do you think their conversation is going to be especially valuable and especially interesting versus a different host or a different outlet? And then always have a specific call to action. So this is kind of a news hook within your pitch. It's the why now, who cares, what do you want them to do, what do you want them to say? So what is it that you would be asking of their audience to do or to hear or to share? And so emphasizing why now, why it's timely and relevant is also important to why you want to have that conversation with them. Again, little activity you could jot down, as you're thinking about this pitch that you might write as I'm talking through this. What is unique about the perspective or the story that your spokesperson can offer? So maybe not only that personal side of what's the angle, but what is it that you would offer in a conversation? Why would they want to have this conversation? Are they especially passionate about the topic? Are they funny? If you're thinking of someone you've been wanting to target, why do you think they would have such a great conversation? What can they relate on? What can they discuss that might be different than with someone else? And then include that call to action in there. What are you thinking about? Oh, I want the audience to do this. I hadn't thought of it before. I just really wanted to tell my story. But what I really want them to take away is this. So for yourself, level the playing field. This is an opportunity in the digital space for you to really get your voice out there, the same as everyone else's. Changing that narrative from, oh, it's so saturated, how am I going to break into? Why not me? If everyone else is doing it, if everyone else is out there getting podcast interviews and YouTube channel interviews and guest blog posts, why not you? Why not your spokesperson? So it really brings everyone together. It's an opportunity for a conversation across all of these different platforms. So once you have your pitch, you can use that in your own messaging on your own social media. If you think it's a great pitch, don't let it go to waste in an inbox. Use that as your message. Use that as your why and your news for yourself. Pitch your targets where they are. So, we've talked about the inboxes being flooded. Everybody's on all these social media platforms. Well, do you see that a podcast host or a blogger or an influencer tends to reply to comments on a certain platform or tends to post more on a certain platform? Start engaging with them, like their posts, reply to their comments. Ultimately remain relevant. Don't just be another person in an inbox. Show that you're out there paying attention to the content that they're sharing. Because if they have a podcast, if they have a blog, they think that their content is valuable as well. And so, in order for you to show that you're valuable to them, make them feel like they're also valuable to you and engage in that conversation with them. And that is all I have for you.